What would make an entire family vanish without a trace? Their meals still warm on the table, their beds neatly made, their Bible left open and marked in blood. In the Ozark Mountains of 1776, the Pruitt family set out to build a new life. What they found instead was something no record could fully explain, and no authority dared to acknowledge. Tonight, we're opening the pages of a story that was buried in silence, journals that faltered mid-sentence, soldiers who were never seen again, and whispers of caves that seemed to breathe like lungs beneath the earth. Official reports called them deserters, accidents or tragedies. Folklore called it something else entirely. And through more than a century of disappearances, one pattern remained. The land did not let its families leave whole. Before we begin, I want to welcome you to the channel. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is for you right now. And if you enjoy uncovering the darkest corners of forgotten history, make sure to like this video and subscribe, because what waits in these mountains is a story too dark to vanish. Families rarely abandon their homes without reason. When a man leaves behind land he has worked for decades, when a woman follows though her health falters, and when children are pulled into the unknown wilderness, it is never done lightly. Something always drives them out. For Nathaniel Pruitt, that drive was desperation. Born in 1734 to English immigrants in Virginia, he carved out a modest life as carpenter and farmer, but the soil no longer gave what it once had, and his debts mounted. In a letter to a cousin, written with a hand steadier than his fortune, he confessed, "The debts grow beyond my means to satisfy them. I have heard tell of land in the Western Territories, where a man might claim acreage sufficient to establish a legacy for his children." There was also Sarah, his wife. Parish records note her decline after the birth of their youngest child. A physician suggested that a change of air might restore her. To Nathaniel, this meant more than health. It meant a chance to erase debt, restore strength, and claim a future that no Virginia field could offer. They had 5 children, each marking a piece of the family's fragile hope. Thomas, 17, worked with his father as if already grown. Elizabeth, 16, guided the younger ones through psalms and letters. Catherine, 12, was restless, sharp-eyed, questioning in ways that unsettled adults. Samuel, only 6, clung to his sisters. Rebecca, the infant, was carried always in Sarah's arms. To uproot such a household was a gamble against both hardship and fate. Yet records mark their passage clearly. In Kentucky, a trader's ledger shows their purchase of provisions, corn seed, powder, cloth. A military fort dispatch lists them passing through in March 1776, a family of 7 bound westward. By April they had reached the Ozarks, far beyond the safety of Virginia farms. The land they chose was strict. Ingrid Nathaniel's claim, filed with a French colonial officer, describes 200 acres of meadow and timber framed by limestone bluffs. A stream cut through the valley, and wild game filled the forests. His signature on the claim appears strong, written by a man certain he had found salvation. For a time it seemed true. A missionary traveling through that June wrote of a cabin rising larger than most frontier dwellings, with sleeping quarters, a hearth, and a root cellar. Sarah, he noted, looked restored, her melancholy gone. Nathaniel himself wrote in July, "The soil yields bountifully. We want for nothing." On paper, it looked like triumph. They had abandoned ruin and found renewal. Yet stories of the valley suggest a silence that even the birds would not break. Locals avoided it, leaving its meadow untouched. The Pruitts did not know, or perhaps chose not to care. Their home stood proud, their family strong, and their fields began to bloom. But at the base of the limestone bluff behind their new house, hidden by rock and shadow, was an opening in the earth. It waited for them. The Ozark wilderness was not gentle, yet the Pruitt family seemed to thrive as if chosen for it. Their cabin rose from the valley floor in the summer of 1776, hewn logs stacked with care, smoke curling from the chimney like a flag of victory. To those who passed through, few though they were, The sight of such industry was remarkable. A traveling missionary recorded his admiration. A home larger than most, with a broad common room, separate sleeping quarters, and a root cellar deep enough to keep provisions through winter. He noted that the Pruitts labored with an energy and harmony uncommon on the frontier. The land itself offered every promise. A clear running creek wound close to the cabin, its waters cold and steady. The meadow soil was rich, easily turned for corn, beans, and squash. Timber stood in abundance, game roamed freely, and fish filled the stream. In his letters back to Virginia, Nathaniel described the bounty with pride. The soil yields bountifully with little encouragement. We want for nothing that honest labor cannot provide. Sarah, once frail, began to recover in this new air. Neighbors and missionaries alike observed her renewed strength. She tended the garden, carried her infant with vigor, and laughed again in ways her family had not heard since before Rebecca's birth. Nathaniel wrote with relief that her melancholy had lifted, as though the mountains themselves had granted her reprieve. The children too flourished. Thomas helped his father fell trees and clear fields. Elizabeth turned a corner of the cabin into a makeshift school, where she taught her siblings letters and psalms. Catherine showed a restless brilliance, often found sketching or watching the bluffs with unblinking curiosity. Even Samuel, barely 6, ran with a confidence unknown in Virginia's overworked fields. In these first months, the Pruitts looked less like refugees of debt and sickness, and more like a family reborn. The cabin became more than shelter. It was a statement carved into wilderness. Its hearth burned steady, its garden grew, and its walls rang with the sounds of children learning and parents working. For a moment they had everything a frontier family could ask for: health, food, hope, and the promise of inheritance. But perfection on the frontier is always fragile. Behind the laughter and steady work, the land carried older stories. The limestone bluffs stood like sentinels above the valley, their shadows stretching across the cabin at dusk. Settlers who later came to the region spoke of the silence there, the way birds avoided the trees, the way the air grew still as though holding back a secret. The Pruitts could not have known, or perhaps they chose not to see. Their house was raised on fertile earth, but beneath that same ground lay something older, something that had been waiting long before they arrived. The root cellar they built so carefully was only the beginning. On the western edge of the Pruitt claim, the limestone bluff rose like a jagged wall against the sky. It was here, while exploring the slope, that young Thomas noticed a shadow too deep to be cast by rock alone. Half hidden by rubble and creeping moss, a narrow gap in the cliff seemed to breathe cold air. To Thomas, it looked like adventure. To Nathaniel, it looked like trouble. Nathaniel's journal, dated September 18th, 1776, captures the unease. He wrote that the darkness seemed to swallow the light in a manner not natural. He confessed he had no intention of entering, forbidding his son from stepping inside. The words carry not only caution but fear, the kind of instinct that tightens the chest before danger even shows itself. Sarah, however, saw it differently. She had lived long enough on the frontier to treat caves as simple landmarks. To her, the opening was just stone and shadow. She teased her husband for imagining threats where none existed, insisting that he was letting superstition guide him. Nathaniel let her words stand, but he wrote privately, "I cannot shake the feeling that some things are best left undisturbed." Thomas could not forget it. The boy returned to the bluff again and again, sometimes before dawn, sometimes in silence when he thought no one was watching. Nathaniel caught him more than once, standing motionless at the gap, his eyes fixed on the darkness. The warnings grew harsher. No child was to approach the bluff, no play within sight of the cave. He even piled stones before the entrance in a futile attempt to block the way. But a cave does not close, because a father wishes it so. Nathaniel began to notice the strange stillness near the bluff. Birds that filled the trees elsewhere in the valley grew silent here. The wind, when it shifted, seemed to echo in patterns too steady for chance. He described the sound as hollow, as though the mountain itself had lungs. In his final note on the matter that month, Nathaniel tried to set his mind in order. "I will not enter. The children are forbidden. Whatever lies beyond must remain unknown." It was a vow written with conviction, but the land has a way of testing convictions, and some openings, once discovered, will not stay ignored. At first it was Thomas alone who noticed it, a sound too steady, too measured, to belong to the wind. He told his father it came at night, a low pulse rising from the bluff, as though the earth itself carried a heartbeat. Nathaniel tried to quiet the boy's imagination. He told him it was air moving through stone, nothing more. But Thomas insisted it was different, the rhythm unnatural, almost deliberate. Within days, Elizabeth began to hear something too. For her it was not a pulse, but voices, soft, overlapping tones that carried no words, yet somehow formed a chorus. She said they rose and fell like singing that could not be understood. Nathaniel listened to her carefully, then dismissed it in front of the others, unwilling to let fear take root in his house. Still, his journal tells a different story. Sarah cannot hear it, nor the younger children. But the older ones lie awake, restless, listening. "I tell them it is the wind, yet I do not believe this myself." The disturbances grew sharper as September turned colder. Thomas was found awake at odd hours, staring at the floor as if listening to something beneath it. Elizabeth grew quiet, her eyes fixed on the bluff at dusk, as though waiting for an answer. Even Catherine, who had not mentioned the cave before, began to wander closer to it, drawn in silence. Nathaniel's entries show the strain of denial. By day he worked the fields, reassuring Sarah and the younger children that nothing was wrong. By night he lay awake, ears straining against the silence, waiting for the sound to begin. When it came, he described it as both near and far, a pulse that did not fade with distance, but seemed to seep through soil and timber surrounding the cabin itself. Sarah remained practical, telling him that men heard what they feared, and children mirrored their father's worry. Yet even she grew uneasy when Elizabeth repeated a lint of scripture she had never been taught. When asked where she learned it, the girl only smiled. The explanations were too thin to comfort him. Wind does not move like a heartbeat. Children do not recite passages they have never read. Still, Nathaniel kept his doubts private, unwilling to speak aloud what he suspected, that something more than air was stirring in the limestone beneath them. What the family could not yet admit was that their valley was no longer only theirs. The sounds marked the first intrusion, a quiet claim on their nights, and beneath their feet, in chambers of stone carved long before their arrival, something had begun to stir. It began with scratches in the soil before the cave mouth. Nathaniel found them one morning, symbols carved into the earth with a precision no child could manage. They were arranged in a circle, each mark different yet bound together as though part of a design. When he asked Thomas about them, the boy swore he knew nothing. Nathaniel covered the symbols with stones, hoping to bury both the marks and his unease. But the markings did not remain buried. Days later more appeared, sharper and cleaner, as though etched by a deliberate hand. They spread beyond the bluff, reaching the corners of the homestead itself. Nathaniel uncovered them behind furniture, carved faintly into the beams of the cabin, even beneath rugs where no child should have thought to scratch. "They multiplied daily," he wrote, "and I have not caught anyone in the act." The children, meanwhile, grew stranger. Catherine was found standing before the fire in the middle of the night, her eyes reflecting the flames without blinking. When Nathaniel touched her shoulder, she spoke in a voice far deeper than her 12 years allowed, stringing together words from no known tongue. By morning she claimed no memory of the event. Elizabeth changed as well. She began to recite scripture she had never been taught, entire passages from Judges delivered with steady calm. Nathaniel demanded to know where she had learned them, but the girl only smiled, a smile that unsettled him more than her words. He wrote of her teeth, noting they seemed different somehow. though he could not explain what he meant. The more the children spoke, the less they felt like his own. At meals they watched one another intently, exchanging glances as if sharing silent instructions. At night, Thomas was discovered again in the cellar, saying that voices called his name from beneath the floor. Sarah tried to dismiss it all. She called the sim Bowl's tricks of the children, the voices fever-born imaginings, the scripture a sign of gifted memory. But even she began to lose her conviction when she found small burns on the children's backs, perfectly round, forming patterns. She accused Nathaniel of punishment, but he swore no hand of his had done it. The cabin, once a place of renewal, had become crowded with signs that belonged to no one in the family. The walls carried scratches, the children carried marks, and their voices carried words too old to be learned. Nathaniel's writing grew darker. "I no longer believe they are wholly mine," he confessed. "Something has laid claim to them." The cave no longer stood silent outside the cabin. Its shadow had entered the home. Nathaniel Pruitt's handwriting changed in those last weeks of 1776. Earlier entries had been firm, controlled, the hand of a man determined to record the progress of his homestead. By November, the script grew uneven, rushed, as if written in moments stolen from dread. His words faltered, then ceased. He described Thomas, waking in the cellar, claiming he had heard his name whispered from the earth. The boy offered no explanation for how he got there, saying only that he felt compelled. Nathaniel found him curled among barrels and tools, face pale, ears pressed to the ground as though listening for a reply. Elizabeth, too, seemed altered. She no longer recited her lessons willingly, but instead muttered lines of scripture unbidden, fragments that made little sense when pieced together. Her eyes lingered on her siblings with an intensity that unsettled him. Nathaniel wrote, "She watches them as though awaiting a signal I cannot hear." The markings worsened. Symbols appeared in places no hand should have reached, etched high along beams, scratched beneath the hearthstones, drawn into the dust of the cellar floor. He swept them away, only to find them reappearing by dawn. "They multiply in silence," he confessed, "and I can no longer tell whether it is my children or something else that carves them." Sarah finally admitted something unnatural was unfolding. She found burns across the children's shoulders and backs, perfect circles arranged in lines and patterns. The marks were not raw wounds, but seared impressions, as if branded without heat. She turned on Nathaniel in fury, accusing him of discipline gone cruel, but he swore no hand of his had done it. "She believes me," he wrote, "but it frightens her more to imagine the alternative." Catherine continued to speak in a tongue unknown, her voice thick and low, nothing like a girl's. At times she stood staring into the fire, until her lips parted, as if listening to some unseen presence. Nathaniel tried shaking her awake, but she looked through him as though he were already gone. By December, his entries carried the tone of a man who understood he was losing everything. "They are in the walls now. They speak with borrowed tongues. I have failed to protect them from what was waiting here long before we arrived." His final lines came on December 2nd, written in a hurried, uneven scrawl. "God forgive me for bringing my family to this place. They are not my children any longer. Perhaps there is still time before the trader arrives. Perhaps not." After that, the pages fall silent. No more entries, no explanations, only the steady dark that crept from the cave into the Pruitt home. When Jean-Baptiste Duval rode into the valley on December the 7th, 1776, he expected nothing more than to trade pelts and supplies. What he found instead would haunt him for the rest of his life. The Pruitt cabin stood in perfect order, smoke curling faintly from its chimney, the roof intact, the fences upright. Yet the silence pressing against the air felt wrong. Even before dismounting, he sensed the absence. No children's voices, no animals, no sound of work. The front door hung ajar. Inside, a meal sat laid upon the table, 5 plates set though the family numbered 7. The food was still warm, steam rising faintly, as though abandoned only moments before. Garments were neatly folded on chairs. The fire burned low in the hearth, not extinguished but untended. Everything looked suspended, as if the household had paused and never resumed. What disturbed him most was the family Bible left open on the table. Several passages in the Book of Judges were marked not with ink, but with what appeared to be blood, streaked across the thin pages. Duval later admitted he would not repeat the verses aloud, though they were passages he had known since childhood. "They trouble my thoughts even now," he wrote, "for I cannot reconcile what I saw with the faith I hold." He searched the sleeping quarters but found no sign of disturbance. Beds neatly made, possessions undisturbed, no indication of flight. Outside, the snow showed only his own tracks, fresh and unbroken, as though no one had left the house in days. The stillness thickened with each step, pressing into his chest until even the sound of his breath felt intrusive. In his ledger, Duval's account abruptly falters when he reaches the cellar. The surviving pages contain lines later blackened with ink, words deliberately obscured. What he did reveal was chilling enough. "I discovered, but I shall not speak of it. Some things are best left undocumented, lest they take root in one's dreams." The omission speaks louder than any words he might have written. Terrified, he abandoned the homestead without lingering. He rode through the night, risking the perils of the frontier rather than remain until morning. To the colonial administrator, he later admitted that although no figure had confronted him, he felt watched every moment he was inside. "It was as though the walls themselves bore eyes," he wrote, "and they followed me as I moved." Duval's account is the first record from an outsider. His testimony confirms what Nathaniel's journal had only suggested, that the family was gone, their home preserved in unnatural stillness, and something in the cellar too disturbing to put into words. The Pruitt house was no longer a place of survival. It had become a stage set for disappearance, where life had frozen, but the living had been erased. 3 militiamen rode into the valley on December 12, 1776, armed with muskets and the authority of the colonial fort. Their names survive in rosters: Corporal James Harlow, Private William Scherer, and Private Thomas Jenkins. Their orders were simple: confirm the French trader's report, investigate the Pruitt homestead, and return with their findings. None of them ever did. Official records were swift to explain away the loss. By January 1777, the 3 were listed as deserters, their pay forfeited. The classification was unusual. Desertion implied choice, betrayal of duty, yet these men had been dispatched on a sanctioned mission. In that era, soldiers who failed to return were normally marked missing. Why then were these men written off as cowards? Claude Fontaine, the colonial administrator who had signed their orders, provides the answer. His private correspondence, hidden for nearly 2 centuries, tells a different story. In a letter dated January 25, 1777, Fontaine admitted grave concern. The men had not deserted, they had vanished. He interviewed Duval a second time and noted the trader's agitation whenever the root cellar was mentioned. Fontaine wrote, "He exhibits signs of acute distress, as though recalling something unfit for human speech." Fontaine pressed for a larger expedition, warning his superiors that the disappearance of both a family and a military patrol could not be dismissed as coincidence. He hinted at geological concerns as well. The limestone bluffs surrounding the homestead contained vast cave systems, some recently mapped by scientific expeditions. He feared those caverns might connect with what Duval had glimpsed beneath the Pruitt cellar. No reply to his request survives. Instead, the matter seemed to dissolve into silence. Later dispatches from the fort describe patrols in the region, but none mentioned the Pruitts or the missing soldiers. The official story had already been shaped. 3 men abandoned their post. Case closed. Yet Fontaine's suppressed letter reveals the first clear signs of deliberate concealment. He acknowledged the possibility of influence beyond the usual dangers of frontier life. He warned that something ancient might dwell in the caves, something capable of drawing both families and soldiers to ruin. "This is no mere calamity of war or wilderness," he wrote, but something that waits below. The cover-up began here, with 3 soldiers who walked into the Pruitt homestead and were never seen again. Their names were erased from duty rolls, their fate reduced to a line of bureaucratic fiction. But erasure does not end a story, it only conceals its shape. And in the Ozark wilderness, silence has always been the loudest warning. The disappearance of the Pruitts and the soldiers might have been buried in colonial records, but the story did not die. It lived on in whispers, reshaped with each telling, carried westward by those who settled the Ozark Hills. By the early 1800s, long after the homestead had burned and the official files had been sealed, the tale returned in a different form, not as history, but as folklore. Reverend Silas Whitman, a circuit preacher who traveled through the region between 1818 and 1832, kept notes of the stories told to him around hearth fires and in cabins scattered across the frontier. He expected tales of hardship, hunting, or storms. Instead, he found something else. Settlers spoke of a family that had come before the Revolution, building their home near the limestone bluffs. They warned that the father had uncovered a cave, and that once opened, it could not be forgotten. The details varied little between settlements. The children were said to have changed first, growing silent, their eyes dark as glass. Travelers passing near the valley claimed to see them in the twilight, pale figures who called out invitations to follow, promising shelter and food. Those who trailed after were never seen again. Others told of the mother walking at night, speaking in tongues that carried no meaning to human ears. The father, they said, held out longest, but in the end even he was claimed by whatever waited beneath the earth. Whitman admitted he dismissed the accounts at first as superstition. Yet what troubled him was their consistency. Stories told 50 miles apart, by families who swore they had never met, shared the same details. Children with eyes that reflected no light, markings carved into walls, voices that called from below. He wrote, "I have heard essentially the same narrative, with only minor variations, in settlements too distant to trade rumor. The legends grew darker with each generation. Some claimed the militia had entered the valley but returned changed, speaking with borrowed voices until they too disappeared. Others said the ground itself bore the curse, that no crops would grow on the site, no animals would graze, and those who lingered too long grew restless and strange." It is through these accounts that the memory of the Pruitts endured. While official archives erased their name, folklore carried it forward. The story became less about one family and more about a warning etched into the cultural memory of the region. Parents told children never to play near caves. Hunters spoke of valleys that should not be entered at dusk. Travelers were taught that if they saw children standing silent in a field, they must keep walking. The story refused erasure. What history sealed away, folklore kept alive. A map of warnings passed hand to hand, generation to generation, and within those warnings lay fragments of truth that no administrator could bury. By the 1840s, the Pruitt story was already more legend than fact, yet one man believed it could be untangled from the threads of folklore. William Porter, a schoolmaster turned amateur historian, arrived in the Ozarks in 1841, determined to separate superstition from record. He began with county archives, parish ledgers, and military rosters. What he found instead was absence. Every document he sought, the militia's dispatch orders, the colonial fort's December rolls, even property claims, was either missing or marked as restricted. The archivists warned him away, some bluntly, others with quiet pity. One clerk, Porter noted, leaned close and whispered, "Do not go looking for families who have already been buried twice." The remark only deepened his resolve. Porter traced the name of Corporal James Harlow, one of the 3 militiamen declared deserters. He located Harlow's surviving relatives in a rural township. From them he received an heirloom, a small copper plate etched with symbols. The markings matched those described in local folklore, repeating circles and angular cuts, a pattern that looked more deliberate than decorative. The family claimed Harlow had carried it after returning briefly from the mission, before he disappeared again, leaving no grave and no explanation. Through persistence, Porter also uncovered a sealed letter written by Claude Fontaine, the administrator who had originally dispatched the soldiers. The letter, hidden in a private estate collection, confirmed what official records denied. Fontaine admitted that Duval had seen human remains in the cellar of the Pruitt cabin, not bones as left by death, but arranged in shapes as though displayed for a purpose. Fontaine feared that disclosure would provoke panic, and so the letter was sealed, marked for no eyes beyond his own. The deeper Porter pressed, the stranger the accounts became. One was a tired militiaman, half mad with age, muttered that the three sent into the valley had returned only in appearance. He claimed their voices were wrong, their manner vacant, and that within days they vanished again, leaving nothing but their weapons behind. Porter recorded the confession, noting that the man wept as he spoke. Obsessed, Porter compiled his findings into a manuscript, but as his work grew, so did his instability. Letters to colleagues reveal a shift in tone, from scholarly curiosity to obsession bordering on fear. He wrote of seeing the symbols in his dreams, of waking to find them traced in condensation on his windows. He began to believe that the act of researching the Pruitts had drawn their presence closer. In 1843, his study caught fire under suspicious circumstances. The blaze consumed his notes, journals, and collected testimonies. Neighbors claimed Porter set the fire himself in a fit of madness, shouting that his papers whispered at night. He vanished soon after, leaving no record of where he went or whether he survived. Every record missing, every archivist warning him away, and still he pursued it, until the pursuit consumed him. The Pruitts might have been the first, but they were not the last. Different names, same fate. In 1847, the Collins family settled less than 20 miles from the valley where the Pruitts once lived. Their beginning mirrored that of every frontier household, a small cabin, a cleared garden, the promise of survival in the wilderness. For a time, they prospered. But neighbors soon reported strange sounds at night and unusual behavior in the Collins children. 3 were seen standing in the yard after dusk, hands linked, speaking in unison words no one understood. A traveler noted that their voices did not rise and fall like children's play, but droned together, hollow and practiced. When neighbors intervened, they found the children marked with lesions, geometric patterns etched into their skin, small circles joined by lines. The parents offered no explanation, and soon they too grew silent. The father was last seen staring into the trees, lips moving without sound. The mother was discovered days later, collapsed beside her hearth, her hands still clutching a Bible she never opened again. The children were taken into custody, but records end abruptly. Their names disappear from parish rolls, and no graves exist. 3 decades later, in 1879, the Whitaker family arrived in the same region, determined to tame the land others avoided. Their story followed the same grim pattern. The children were said to wander near caves, scratching markings into stone with impossible precision. Neighbors claimed the children's laughter changed to a flat, echoing tone that carried too far in the night air. As months passed, the Whitaker parents stopped speaking to anyone at all. The family grew withdrawn, refusing trade or conversation. Eventually, officials intervened. The children were placed in an asylum where attendants recorded their unnerving behavior. They spoke not as individuals, but together, finishing one another's sentences without pause, often reciting entire passages in unison. One note describes them pressing their ears to the floorboards, whispering replies to questions no one had asked. The parents never left the homestead. When investigators finally entered, they found the cabin stripped of warmth, furniture overturned, markings carved into every beam. The Whitakers themselves were discovered seated at the table, silent, their eyes open but unseeing. Doctors labeled it catatonia. Neighbors called it something else. Across both cases, Collins in 1847 and Whitaker's in 1879, the details echoed the Pruitts. Children speaking as one, geometric lesions burned into skin, an unnatural fascination with caves, and parents who slipped into silence until they were no longer recognizable. Different names, same fate. The pattern had returned, as though the land itself demanded repetition, replaying the Pruitts' descent with each new family, bold enough to stake their claim in that cursed valley. When the Miller family was found dead in the spring of 1904, authorities moved quickly to explain it away. The official cause was simple, almost mundane: mushroom poisoning. Neighbors accepted the verdict on paper, though none could reconcile it with what they had seen. The Millers had been respected settlers, their homestead built on fertile land near the same limestone ridges that had once held the Pruitt farm. On the evening they were discovered, all 6 family members were seated at the dining table, each upright in their chair, their bodies untouched by decay, though they had been dead for days. Plates were set before them, food half-eaten, hands folded neatly in their laps. The sheriff's report called it a tragic accident, a supper made deadly by misidentified fungi. But the details told another story. A deputy, unnamed in public records, left behind a private letter to his brother. That letter described the scene in words the sheriff had omitted. It was as if they were arranged, he wrote, seated with care, posed by something unseen. He noted the unnatural calm of the bodies, no sign of pain or struggle, no evidence of illness. Their eyes were open, staring forward, unblinking. The deputy also recorded what he found in the root cellar. The Millers had expanded it recently, digging deeper than most farmers would need. At the far end, the floor fell away into a narrow shaft, descending into darkness. Around its edges were markings, carved not with tools, but etched directly into the stone, symbols that seemed to shift in shape when viewed from different angles. He confessed in his letter that he could not look at them for long without feeling dizzy, as though the patterns moved even while standing still. Among the Miller possessions, he also discovered a journal belonging to the eldest son. The entries began with ordinary notes about crops and livestock, but so on devolved into ramblings of voices without words. The boy wrote that he heard them strongest in the cellar at night, vibrations in the soil that carried meaning he could not explain. His final entry ended mid-sentence. The deputy urged the sheriff to release these findings, but the answer was clear. The story would remain mushroom poisoning. No mention of the shaft, no symbols, no journal. The official account was tidy, safe, and false. In his closing lines, the deputy admitted he could not remain in the territory. He resigned, sold his property, and left the Ozarks altogether. "I cannot live under a lie," he confessed, "and I will not live in a place where the ground itself whispers to children." The Miller family was buried in silence, their graves marked only by the same official explanation used countless times before. Yet their case fit the pattern too closely to ignore. Seated in perfect stillness at the table, they were not victims of misidentified mushrooms. They were part of something far older, replaying itself once again beneath the bluffs. Edward Larson arrived in the Ozarks not as a settler, but as a seeker of truth. A journalist from St. Louis, he had built his reputation on exposing corruption and forgotten crimes. When he first heard the whispers of families vanishing in the mountains, he thought it was frontier legend. But in 1936, convinced that behind the stories lay something more, he moved his wife and 2 children into a cabin not far from the ruins of the Miller homestead. His plan was to investigate, to gather testimony, explore the caves, and write the definitive account that would separate fact from folklore. At first, his notebooks read like any reporter's fieldwork. He recorded interviews with locals who warned him of caves where children once played and never returned. He sketched symbols described by aging neighbors, drawings that matched those preserved from earlier cases. But his notes soon shifted from documentation to something more personal, more unsettled. By late summer, Larson wrote of hearing a low vibration at night, a pulse that hums through the floorboards. His children began to complain of whispers in the walls. His wife, once dismissive, confessed that she too felt watched whenever she passed the cellar. "It is as though the house breathes," he noted. Weeks later, the first markings appeared, faint circles etched into the wood by the hearth. Larson photographed them, though the images were said to blur, the symbols indistinct on film. His children began waking in the cellar, claiming they were called there by voices that had no words. "They pressed their ears to the ground," he wrote, as though listening for instructions. His journal entries grew frantic. He recorded his daughter reciting passages from scripture she had never learned, his son speaking in unison with her in a tone neither recognized as their own. He described burns forming on their skin, small circuitous, law scars arranged in geometric patterns. "They are being claimed," he wrote, "piece by piece." By October, Larson admitted his wife no longer seemed herself. She moved through the house silently, her eyes fixed on the bluff at dusk. She spoke less each day, until the only words she uttered were fragments of phrases that matched those in his children's mouths. "They answer one another now," he recorded, in a language not theirs, in voices that sound borrowed. His final entry, dated November 3rd, carries the weight of resignation. "They are not my family anymore. The change is complete. I hear them moving when they are still. I see them watching when they sleep. I have uncovered the truth, but the truth has uncovered me." After that, there are no more words. The cabin was found weeks later, abandoned, its tables set, the journals scattered across the floor. No trace of the Larsons remained. The man who sought the truth became its last victim, and in his own meticulous notes lies the clearest record of the transformation that had haunted the Ozarks for generations, the steady replacement of a family until nothing human was left. By the mid-20th century, folklore alone no longer satisfied those who sought answers. Scientists and researchers, armed with modern methods, turned their attention to the Ozarks and the valley where so many families had vanished. They came not with prayer or journals, but with field kits, survey maps, and the confidence that reason could dispel centuries of fear. What they found instead was that the land resisted explanation. When scholars approached, the caves looked back. In 1947, a geological survey team documented unusual air currents near the limestone bluffs. Their instruments detected pressure shifts that rose and fell with unnatural regularity, like the rhythm of a lung. One geologist suggested the phenomenon was caused by deep caverns breathing with temperature changes. Yet in his field notes he confessed unease. "The sound is too steady. At night it mimics a pulse." Weeks later, he abandoned the project, citing exhaustion and vivid nightmares that left him unable to work. By the 1950s, anthropologists explored a cultural angle. They compared the Ozark legends to accounts of cave spirits in Europe and Asia, speculating about shared archetypes. But several researchers reported that after spending time in the valley, they experienced hallucinations, fleeting visions of children in the tree line, voices calling their names in the wind. One withdrew entirely from academia, writing only that he had studied belief until belief studied me. Another line of inquiry focused on biology. Mycologists tested samples of fungus growing near the cave mouths. They argued that spores, inhaled in sufficient quantity, might induce auditory hallucinations, explaining the whispers so often reported. For a moment it seemed the mystery could be contained in science, but when experiments were replicated under controlled conditions, the spores caused no such effect. Worse, the field researchers insisted the samples continued to grow after incineration, spreading even in sealed containers. Their claims were dismissed as hysteria, and they were quietly removed from the project. In the 1960s, a team of psychologists proposed that isolation and mineral toxins could induce altered states of consciousness. They conducted fieldwork in the region, sleeping in tents near the bluff. Within 3 nights, half the team refused to continue. Their journals describe waking to sounds beneath the ground, vibrations in the soil that persisted even when instruments registered nothing. One man recorded seeing his colleague standing outside the tent at midnight, only to find him still asleep inside when he returned. By the time funding ended, the scientific community had quietly stepped back. Official reports cited lack of conclusive evidence, but private correspondents told another story: breakdowns, sleeplessness, and fear that inquiry itself carried danger. A phrase repeated in more than one letter: "The more we looked, the more it looked back." Rational attempts collapsed where folklore had endured. The scientists who entered the valley returned with the same silence as the settlers who had fled it. Some truths could not be catalogued or explained. They could only be endured or avoided. Some doors, once opened, never close. In 1952, the last officially acknowledged case tied to the valley occurred. Richard Conley, a geologist employed by the state, brought his wife and 2 young sons to study the limestone formations near the old Pruitt homestead. His notes from the first week describe ordinary work: measurements, sketches, core samples. Then the entries change. He began recording vibrations in the ground, like steady percussion beneath the soil. His wife, in a letter never mailed, mentioned the boys waking at night, pressing their ears to the floorboards. By the second week, Conley's journal contained only fragments, voices without words. The ground is hollow. His final entry, dated June 17th, read simply, "They are listening now." When search parties arrived, the cabin was intact but empty. The family's belongings remained in place. Food was left half-prepared on the stove, no signs of struggle, no bodies, no footprints leading away. Like the Pruitts before them, the Conleys were simply gone. After 1952, the state took action. The valley was quietly sealed off, deeds invalidated, the land declared unsafe for settlement. Modern maps began to omit details of the region, leaving a blank stretch of forest where the Conley homestead had stood. Officially, it became restricted geological terrain. Unofficially, locals knew better. Guides refused to enter the bluffs after dark. Hunters avoided the area entirely, claiming they heard children calling their names in the twilight. A handful of cases persisted into the 1970s. Children who wandered too close, vanishing for hours or days before reappearing. Those who returned were changed. Parents described them as quieter, more watchful, their eyes duller than before. None of the children could remember where they had been. Today, the story survives only in whispers. Archivists who seek the records find gaps. Maps still leave empty spaces. And in the towns nearby, warnings are passed to newcomers: keep your children close, keep clear of the bluffs, and never step into a cave you cannot see the end of. The pattern has never broken. From the Pruitts in 1776 to the Conleys in 1952, families have been claimed in the same way: lured, silenced, replaced. Officials have written it off as desertion, madness, poison, or accident, but the folklore remains stubborn. The land remembers what the records erase. If the cycle holds, it is not finished. The process is patient, methodical, and unfinished. The valley still waits, silent, its limestone bluffs guarding the openings below. The Pruitts were not the end of the story. They were only the beginning.